The morning sun painted golden streaks across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as 8-year-old Princess Charlotte walked slowly through the long corridors. Her small footsteps echoed in the vast hallways, creating a lonely sound that seemed to bounce off the ancient walls. The palace, usually filled with the quiet efficiency of staff members going about their duties, felt different today. There was a heaviness in the air that even a child could sense. Charlotte clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hoppy, close to her chest. The soft toy had been with her since she was 3 years old, a gift from her great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, before she passed away. The rabbit's once bright blue ribbon had faded over the years, and one of its ears was slightly torn from countless nights of comfort, but Charlotte loved it more than any of her expensive toys or beautiful dresses. She had woken up that morning to the sound of hushed voices outside her bedroom door. Through the crack beneath the heavy wooden door, she could see shadows moving back and forth. The voices belonged to her nanny, Mrs. Henderson, and one of the palace officials, but their words were too quiet for her to understand. What she could sense, however, was the worry in their tones. Charlotte had learned early in her young life that adults often spoke in code around her. They would use phrases like, "The situation is delicate," or "We must consider the implications," when they thought she was not listening. But Charlotte was a smart child, much smarter than most adults gave her credit for. She could read the expressions on people's faces, the way their shoulders tensed when they were stressed, and how their voices changed when they were trying to hide something important. Today felt like one of those days when the grown-ups were hiding something big. She made her way to the breakfast room, where she usually ate with her brothers, Prince George and Prince Louis. The large dining table, which could seat 12 people, looked enormous with just her small place setting at one end. Mrs. Henderson had prepared her usual breakfast, warm porridge with honey, fresh strawberries, and a glass of orange juice, but Charlotte found she had no appetite. "Where are Mama and Papa?" Charlotte asked Mrs. Henderson, who was bustling around the room, straightening things that were already perfectly straight. Mrs. Henderson paused for a moment, her hand stilling on the curtain she was adjusting. "They had to attend to some important matters this morning, Your Royal Highness. They will see you later today." Charlotte nodded, but she knew there was more to it. Her parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, had been having many important matters lately. She had overheard fragments of conversations about public duties and constitutional responsibilities and the weight of the crown. These phrases meant nothing to her, but the way her parents' faces looked when they spoke about these things told her everything she needed to know. After picking at her breakfast, Charlotte decided to explore the palace. It was something she did when she felt confused or lonely. The palace was like a small city, with hundreds of rooms, secret passages that the staff used, and gardens that seemed to go on forever. She knew she was not supposed to wander alone, but today she felt drawn to walk through the halls. She passed the portrait gallery, where dozens of paintings of her ancestors hung on the walls. Kings and queens from centuries past looked down at her with serious expressions, wearing heavy crowns and elaborate robes. Charlotte often wondered if any of them had been children once, if they had ever felt scared or lonely or confused about their place in the world. As she walked deeper into the palace, she began to hear voices coming from behind a set of heavy doors. She recognized her father's voice, deeper and more serious than usual. There were other voices too, men and women she did not recognize, but who spoke with the kind of authority that made everyone else listen carefully. Charlotte pressed herself against the wall beside the door, not quite brave enough to peek inside, but desperate to understand what was happening. The words she could make out were troubling. Crisis, immediate action required, the stability of the monarchy, and difficult decisions ahead. Her heart began to beat faster. Whatever was happening, it was big and serious and scary. She hugged Mr. Hoppy tighter and felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. At 8 years old, she understood that her life was different from other children's lives. She knew that being a princess meant responsibilities and rules, and always being watched by the public, but she had never felt the weight of it quite like this before. The voices in the room grew more intense, and Charlotte heard her mother's voice join the conversation. Even through the thick doors, she could hear the strain in her mother's usually calm and measured tone. Charlotte wanted nothing more than to run into that room and hug her parents, to feel safe in their arms like she did when she had nightmares, but she knew that was not possible. When her parents were in meetings like this, she was not allowed to interrupt, Feeling overwhelmed and frightened, Charlotte turned away from the door and began walking toward her favorite place in the palace, the garden courtyard. It was a small enclosed space filled with beautiful flowers and a fountain that always made soothing sounds. She often went there when she needed to think or when the palace felt too big and intimidating. As she walked through the corridors leading to the garden, she passed several staff members. Usually they would smile and nod respectfully when they saw her, sometimes stopping to ask about her day or compliment her dress. But today they seemed distracted and worried, their faces wearing the same expressions she had seen on her parents and Mrs. Henderson. The palace, which had always been her home and her safe place, suddenly felt cold and unwelcoming. The beautiful tapestries and priceless artwork that decorated the walls seemed to loom over her, making her feel small and insignificant. The silence that filled the spaces between her footsteps was not the peaceful quiet she was used to, but something heavier and more ominous. Charlotte realized that everything was about to change, even though she did not yet understand how or why. She was just a little girl who wanted her parents to hold her and tell her that everything would be okay. But as she looked around at the worried faces and felt the tension in the air, she began to understand that being okay might not be something that anyone could promise her right now. Charlotte finally reached the garden courtyard, but even her favorite place felt different today. The flowers that usually brought her joy seemed to droop despite the gardener's careful attention, and the fountain's gentle bubbling sound could not drown out the anxiety that filled her chest. She sat on the stone bench where she often came to read or play with her toys, but today she simply stared at the water, watching the light dance on its surface. Mr. Hoppy sat in her lap, and she found herself telling him about her worries, the way she had done countless times before. "Something is wrong, Mr. Hoppy," she whispered to the stuffed rabbit. "Everyone is acting strange, and Mama and Papa look scared. I have never seen them look scared before." The truth was that Charlotte had always seen her parents as the strongest, most capable people in the world. Her father, Prince William, was tall and confident, always knowing exactly what to say and do in any situation. Her mother, Princess Catherine, was graceful and calm, handling every challenge with a smile and the kind of wisdom that made everyone around her feel better. But lately, Charlotte had noticed cracks in their usual composure. She remembered a conversation she had overheard between her parents just a few days earlier. They had been in her father's study, and their voices had carried into the hallway where Charlotte had been walking past. Her mother had said something about the children and protecting them from the worst of it, while her father had responded with words about duty and no choice in the matter. At the time, Charlotte had not understood what they were talking about, but now she wondered if it had something to do with whatever was happening today. She thought about her brothers, George and Louis, and wondered if they knew something she did not. George, being older at 10, sometimes understood things that flew over Charlotte's head. Louis, at 5, was usually too young to notice when the adults were worried, but even he had been quieter lately. As Charlotte sat in the garden, she began to notice that the usual sounds of the palace had changed. Normally, she could hear the distant hum of activity, staff members going about their duties, phones ringing in offices, the occasional sound of cars arriving at the main entrance. Today there was an unusual quiet, broken only by occasional bursts of urgent activity. She could hear footsteps moving quickly through the corridors, doors closing with more force than usual, and hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when anyone approached. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the garden entrance, looking relieved to have found Charlotte. "There you are, Your Royal Highness," she said, though her usual warm smile seemed forced. "Your mother would like to see you in the morning room." Charlotte's heart leaped with hope. Finally, she would be able to talk to her mother and find out what was happening. She followed Mrs. Henderson through the palace, noticing along the way that several rooms that were usually open had their doors firmly closed, and there seemed to be more security personnel than usual, stationed at various points throughout the building. The morning room was one of Charlotte's favorite places to spend time with her mother. It was smaller and more comfortable than the formal sitting rooms, with soft yellow walls and furniture that invited relaxation rather than ceremony. When Charlotte entered, she found her mother standing by the window, looking out at the palace grounds with an expression that seemed far away and troubled. Princess Catherine turned when she heard Charlotte enter, and immediately her face transformed into the warm, loving expression that Charlotte knew so well. But Charlotte was observant enough to notice that the worry did not completely leave her mother's eyes, even when she smiled. "Come here, my darling," Catherine said, opening her arms. Charlotte ran to her mother and felt some of her anxiety melt away as she was enveloped in a familiar, comforting hug. Catherine smelled like the lavender perfume she always wore, and her arms felt strong and protective around Charlotte's small frame. They sat together on the comfortable sofa, with Charlotte curled up against her mother's side. For a few moments, neither of them spoke, and Charlotte felt the first real peace she had experienced all day. But she could feel the tension in her mother's body, the way her breathing was not quite as relaxed as usual. "Mama," Charlotte said quietly, "is something bad happening?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and Charlotte could sense her mother choosing her words carefully. "There are some challenges that your father and I need to handle," Catherine finally said. "Sometimes, when you are in our position, difficult situations arise that require careful attention." Charlotte looked up at her mother's face, studying the expression she knew so well. "Are you scared, Mama?" The question seemed to catch Catherine off guard, and for just a moment her composed mask slipped. Charlotte saw something raw and vulnerable in her mother's eyes, something that looked very much like fear. But Catherine quickly recovered, smoothing Charlotte's hair with gentle fingers. "I am concerned," Catherine admitted, "but you know what helps me when I am worried? Remembering that our family is strong, and that we face everything together. Whatever happens, we will get through it because we love each other and we take care of each other." Charlotte wanted to ask more questions, but before she could speak, there was a knock at the door. One of the palace staff members entered, looking apologetic for the interruption but clearly carrying urgent news. "Your Royal Highness," the man said to Catherine, "your presence is requested in the conference room immediately." Catherine's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded. "I will be there in just a moment." After the man left, Catherine turned back to Charlotte, taking her small hands in her own. "I need to go to another meeting, sweetheart. Mrs. Henderson will stay with you, and perhaps you can spend some time with your books or work on that puzzle you started yesterday." Charlotte nodded, but inside she felt the familiar frustration of being left out, of being considered too young to understand what was happening to her own family. "When will you tell me what is going on?" she asked. Catherine's expression softened, and she leaned down to kiss Charlotte's forehead. "Soon, my love. I promise that when the time is right, your father and I will explain everything to you and your brothers. But right now, we need to focus on handling the situation properly." As her mother left the room, Charlotte felt more alone than ever. She understood that her parents were trying to protect her, but being protected felt an awful lot like being excluded. She was part of this family too, and whatever was affecting them was affecting her as well, whether the adults wanted to admit it or not. The afternoon stretched on endlessly, with Charlotte trying to distract herself with books and toys, but finding it impossible to concentrate on anything. Every sound in the palace seemed amplified. Every conversation seemed to carry hidden meanings, and every adult she encountered looked like they were carrying the weight of terrible news. As evening approached, Charlotte realized that she had barely seen her father all day, and even her brief time with her mother had felt hurried and incomplete. The palace, her home, had become a place of secrets and whispered conversations, and she felt like a stranger in her own life. By evening, Charlotte had retreated to her bedroom, but sleep seemed impossible. She lay in her large four-poster bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the palace around her. Even at night, when the palace was usually quiet except for the security guards making their rounds, there seemed to be more activity than normal. She could hear doors opening and closing, footsteps in the corridors, and the distant sound of cars arriving and departing. Mrs. Henderson had helped her into her nightgown and read her a story, but Charlotte could tell that even her nanny was distracted. The older woman, who had been with the family since George was born, usually had a calming presence that made bedtime feel safe and routine. Tonight, however, she kept glancing toward the door and seemed eager to finish their usual nighttime ritual. After Mrs. Henderson left, promising to check on her in a little while, Charlotte found herself unable to stay in bed. She got up and went to her window, which overlooked one of the palace courtyards. From her room on the second floor, she could see part of the main entrance and the circular driveway, where official cars usually arrived. What she saw made her stomach tighten with worry, There were more cars than usual, black vehicles with tinted windows that she associated with very important visitors. Security personnel were stationed at various points around the courtyard, more than she had ever seen before. The scene looked like what she imagined would happen during a major crisis. Charlotte pressed her face against the cool glass of the window and tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Some of the cars had flags and official markings that she recognized as belonging to government officials. Others were unmarked but had the same serious, important look that meant powerful people were inside. She thought about all the times her parents had tried to explain to her what it meant to be part of the royal family. They had told her about duty and service, about how their family had a special role in helping to lead the country and support the people. But until now, those concepts had seemed abstract, like something that would matter when she was much older. Tonight, for the first time, Charlotte began to understand that being a princess was not just about beautiful dresses and waving to crowds. It meant that when serious things happened in the country, her family was expected to be involved, to make difficult decisions, and to carry responsibilities that other families did not have. The realization was both frightening and overwhelming. She was only 8 years old, but she could see that whatever was happening was big enough to bring all these important people to the palace in the middle of the night. She wondered if other children her age were lying awake in their beds, worried about things they could not understand or control. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Charlotte made a decision that she knew would get her in trouble. She was going to find her parents and demand to know what was happening. She was tired of being treated like a baby, tired of being left out of important family matters, and tired of feeling scared and confused. She put on her slippers and her dressing gown, grabbed Mr. Hoppy for courage, and quietly opened her bedroom door. The corridor outside was dimly lit by the emergency lighting that stayed on all night, casting long shadows that made the familiar hallway look mysterious and slightly threatening. Charlotte had explored the palace many times, and she knew which floorboards creaked and which routes would allow her to move through the building without being detected by the security cameras or the night staff. She made her way carefully toward the area of the palace where the important meetings usually took place. As she got closer to the conference rooms, she could hear voices more clearly. The tone was urgent and serious, with people speaking over each other in the way that happened when everyone had something important to say. She recognized her father's voice, deeper and more authoritative than his usual casual tone. She could also hear her mother, speaking with the kind of crisp efficiency that meant she was in full royal mode. But there were other voices too. People she did not recognize who spoke with the kind of authority that commanded attention. She heard phrases that made no sense to her: constitutional implications, emergency protocols, and immediate succession planning. The words meant nothing to Charlotte, but the urgency with which they were spoken told her that whatever they were discussing was extremely serious. Charlotte found a spot behind a large decorative pillar where she could hear the conversation without being seen. She clutched Mr. Hoppy tightly and tried to understand what the adults were talking about. Some of it was about laws and procedures that were completely beyond her comprehension. But gradually she began to piece together fragments that painted a troubling picture. Something had happened that threatened the stability of the monarchy. There were references to unprecedented circumstances and the need for immediate action. Her grandfather, King Charles, was mentioned frequently, along with phrases about health concerns and the gravity of the situation. Charlotte's heart began to race as she started to understand. Something was wrong with her grandfather, the king. Something serious enough that all these important people had been called to the palace in the middle of the night to discuss what needed to happen next. She thought about her grandfather, King Charles, who had always been kind to her and her brothers. He was the one who had become king after great-grandmother Elizabeth died, stepping into a role that Charlotte knew was enormous and difficult. He had always seemed strong and capable to her, someone who could handle any challenge that came his way. The idea that something might be seriously wrong with him was terrifying. It was not just that she loved him and did not want him to be hurt or sick. It was also the realization that if something happened to the king, everything in their family would change. Her father would become king, which meant that their entire life would be different in ways she could not even imagine. As she listened to the adults talking about procedures and protocols, Charlotte began to understand why everyone had been acting so strangely all day. This was not just a family crisis. It was a national crisis. Whatever happened to her grandfather would affect not just their family but the entire country. The weight of this realization was crushing. Charlotte had always known that her family was different from other families, but she had never fully grasped what that meant in practical terms. Now she was beginning to understand that their personal lives and their public roles were completely intertwined, and that a crisis for one was a crisis for both. She wanted more than anything to run into that room and find comfort in her parents' arms, but she could hear how serious and focused their conversation was. Even if she had the courage to interrupt, she knew that this was not the time for a scared little girl to seek reassurance. Instead, Charlotte stayed hidden behind the pillar, listening to the adults' plan for a future that would change everything she had ever known about her life. For the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be a princess, and the knowledge was far more frightening than anything she could have imagined. Charlotte remained hidden behind the pillar for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The conversation in the conference room had become more intense, with voices rising and falling as different people spoke. She caught fragments about immediate plans, public announcement, and preparing the children. The last phrase made her heart pound harder, because she realized they were talking about her and her brothers. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, something inside Charlotte broke. All the fear and confusion she had been holding in throughout the day came rushing out at once. Before she could stop herself, she began to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears that she had been taught were appropriate for a princess, but the deep, overwhelming sobs of a frightened child who had reached her limit. The sound of her crying echoed through the corridor, and within seconds the voices in the conference room stopped. Charlotte heard chairs scraping against the floor, and footsteps moving quickly toward the door. She knew she had been discovered, but she was too upset to care about the trouble she was about to get into. The door to the conference room opened, and her father appeared, followed immediately by her mother. When they saw Charlotte standing in the corridor in her nightgown, clutching her stuffed rabbit and crying, their expressions changed from surprise to immediate concern. "Charlotte," her mother said, rushing toward her. "Sweetheart, what are you doing here?" But Charlotte was too overwhelmed to answer. All the emotions she had been holding in all day came pouring out in great heaving sobs. She could not catch her breath, and the words she wanted to say were lost in her tears. Her father quickly stepped into the hallway and closed the conference room door behind him, giving them privacy from the officials inside. He knelt down next to Charlotte, his formal demeanor completely forgotten in the face of his daughter's distress. "It's all right, sweetheart," William said gently, reaching out to stroke her hair. "You're safe. We're here." Catherine gathered Charlotte into her arms, and for a moment Charlotte felt the comfort she had been craving all day. Her mother's embrace was warm and familiar, smelling of lavender and home. But even as she felt some relief at finally being with her parents, the fear that had been building inside her continued to pour out. "I know something terrible is happening," Charlotte managed to say between sobs. "Everyone is scared and you won't tell me what's wrong. And I heard you talking about Grandpapa, and I think he's really sick. And I don't understand why everything has to change." William and Catherine exchanged a look over Charlotte's head, and Charlotte could see them having one of those silent conversations that married couples have. Finally, Catherine pulled back slightly so she could look into Charlotte's eyes. "You're right," Catherine said softly. "Something serious is happening and we have been trying to protect you from it. But you're smart enough to know when something is wrong, and you deserve to understand what's affecting our family." William nodded, though Charlotte could see how difficult this conversation was for him. "Your grandfather, the king, is very ill," he said carefully. "The doctors are doing everything they can to help him, but it's a serious situation that requires us to prepare for different possibilities." Charlotte's tears slowed as she tried to process what her father was telling her. "Is Grandpapa going to die?" she asked, the question coming out as barely a whisper. "We don't know," Catherine answered honestly. "We hope and pray that he will recover, but the doctors have told us that we need to be prepared for whatever happens. That's why all these people are here tonight. They're helping us plan for how to take care of the country and our family, no matter what the future brings." Charlotte thought about this for a moment, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her dressing gown. "If something happens to Grandpapa, will Papa become the king?" "Yes," William said simply, "and that would mean big changes for all of us. Changes that we would face together, as a family." The honesty in her parents' voices was both comforting and terrifying. Charlotte appreciated that they were finally treating her like she was old enough to understand serious things. But the reality of what they were telling her was almost too much to absorb. "I'm scared," Charlotte admitted, looking back and forth between her parents. "We're scared too," Catherine said, and Charlotte was surprised by this admission. She had never heard her mother acknowledge being frightened before. Being scared when facing something difficult is completely normal. But you know what helps with fear? Facing it together and making sure we take care of each other. William stood up and looked back toward the conference room door. Charlotte could see the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, the knowledge that important people were waiting for him to continue making crucial decisions. But instead of rushing back to the meeting, he made a choice that surprised her. "The meeting can wait a few more minutes," he said. "Right now, what's most important is making sure our daughter feels safe and loved." The three of them sat down together on a bench in the corridor, with Charlotte between her parents. For the first time all day, she felt like she was part of the family again, instead of being kept on the outside of important events. "What happens now?" Charlotte asked. "Now we wait," Catherine said. "We wait to see how Grandpapa responds to his treatment, and we prepare for whatever we need to do to serve our country and take care of our family. And we make sure that you and George and Louis know that no matter what changes happen, the most important thing will never change." "What's that?" Charlotte asked. "That we love you," William said, "and that we will always be a family, no matter what titles we have or what responsibilities we face." Charlotte leaned against her father's shoulder, feeling some of the tension leave her body. The situation was still scary and uncertain, but at least now she understood what was happening. She was no longer fighting against the unknown, but facing a difficult reality with her parents beside her. "Can I stay with you for a while?" she asked. "I don't want to be alone right now." William and Catherine looked at each other again, and Charlotte could see them weighing the importance of the meeting against their daughter's need for comfort and security. "Of course," Catherine said. "We'll find a way to make this work." As they stood up to figure out where Charlotte could wait while her parents finished their important discussions, Charlotte felt something she had not felt all day. Hope. Not hope that everything would be easy or that scary things would not happen, but hope that whatever came next, her family would face it together. The crisis was far from over, and Charlotte knew that difficult days lay ahead. But for the first time since the morning, she felt like she was not facing the unknown alone. She was part of a family that loved her enough to include her in the truth, even when that truth was frightening. As they walked down the corridor together, Charlotte's parents supporting her on either side, she realized that being a princess was not just about wearing beautiful clothes and living in a palace. It was about being part of something bigger than yourself, something that required courage and strength and the willingness to face whatever came next with dignity and love. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and waiting. Charlotte's parents had arranged for her to stay in a small sitting room adjacent to the conference room, where she could be close to them while they continued their urgent discussions. Mrs. Henderson had been called to stay with her, bringing warm milk and some of Charlotte's favorite books. But Charlotte found it impossible to concentrate on reading. Instead, she sat curled up in an armchair, listening to the muffled sounds of conversation from the next room. Occasionally, her mother or father would step out to check on her, offering reassuring smiles and gentle touches on her head. But Charlotte could see the strain in their faces, the way their eyes carried worry even when they tried to comfort her. Around midnight, there was a sudden change in the atmosphere. The voices in the conference room became more urgent, and Charlotte could hear phones ringing repeatedly. Mrs. Henderson, who had been dozing in her chair, suddenly sat up straight, as if she had sensed that something significant was happening. Within minutes, Charlotte's mother appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Charlotte, sweetheart, we need to go to the hospital," she said gently. "Grandpapa has taken a turn and we want to be there with him." Charlotte's heart clenched with fear, but she nodded bravely. She had been expecting this moment ever since her parents had explained the situation to her. Mrs. Henderson quickly helped her change from her nightgown into proper clothes, and within 20 minutes they were in one of the royal cars, driving through the empty London streets toward the hospital. The city looked different at night, with streetlights creating pools of light in the darkness and very few people on the roads. Charlotte pressed her face against the car window, watching the familiar sights of London pass by. Everything looked the same as it always had, but she knew that by morning, the world might be completely different. Her father sat in the front seat, speaking quietly into his phone with various officials who needed to be kept informed of every development. Her mother sat beside Charlotte in the back seat, holding her hand and occasionally stroking her hair. George and Louis were being brought in a separate car with their protection officers, and Charlotte found herself worried about how her younger brother would handle this situation. When they arrived at the hospital, Charlotte was struck by how different it looked from the medical facilities she had visited during royal engagements. This was not a cheerful children's ward with colorful walls and friendly staff showing them around. This was a serious place where life and death decisions were made, with bright fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic in the air. They were escorted through corridors lined with security personnel to a private wing where King Charles was being treated. Charlotte had never seen so many people in suits and uniforms, all looking grave and speaking in hushed tones. The weight of the moment was evident in every face they passed. When they reached the waiting area outside the king's room, Charlotte saw many familiar faces. Her Uncle Harry had arrived from California looking tired and worried. Her Aunt Anne was there speaking quietly with doctors. Various other family members and close advisors filled the space, creating an atmosphere of worried anticipation. George and Louis arrived shortly after, and Charlotte felt relief at seeing her brothers. George looked scared but was trying to be brave, while 5-year-old Louis seemed confused by all the serious faces and late-night activity. Charlotte took Louis's hand and tried to comfort him, even though she was fighting her own fears. "Is Grandpapa going to be okay?" Louis whispered to her. Charlotte looked at her little brother's trusting face and felt the weight of responsibility. She was no longer just a scared child. She was also a big sister who needed to help her younger brother through this difficult time. "The doctors are taking very good care of him," she said, choosing her words carefully, "and we're all here together," which is what families do when someone they love is sick. A doctor emerged from the king's room and spoke quietly with her father and uncle. Charlotte could not hear what was being said, but she could read the expressions on the adults' faces. The news was not good. Her father returned to where the children were sitting and knelt down in front of them. His face was serious but gentle, and Charlotte could see that he was drawing on all his strength to have this conversation with them. "Children," he said softly, "Grandpapa is very, very sick. The doctors have done everything they can, but his body is too tired to keep fighting. We're going to say goodbye to him now." Charlotte felt her breath catch in her throat. Even though she had known this moment might come, hearing the words spoken aloud made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. She saw George's eyes fill with tears, and Louis's confused expression as he tried to understand what saying goodbye meant. They were led into the king's room, where Charlotte saw her grandfather lying in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than she had ever seen him. Machines beeped quietly around him, and medical staff moved carefully in the background, monitoring his condition. Charlotte approached the bed slowly, her heart breaking at seeing this strong, dignified man in such a vulnerable state. But even in his illness, she could see the kindness in his eyes when he looked at her and her brothers. "Hello, my dear ones," King Charles said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so glad you came to see me." Each of the children took turns speaking with their grandfather, telling him they loved him and sharing little memories from their time together. Charlotte told him about a drawing she had made for him that was still in her room at the palace, and promised to always remember the stories he had told her about their family's history. When it was time to leave the room so that the adults could spend time with the king, Charlotte felt like she was leaving a piece of her childhood behind. The world of innocence and security that she had known was ending, and she was stepping into a reality where loss and responsibility were real and immediate. As they waited in the corridor, Charlotte found herself thinking about all the changes that would come. Her father would become king, which meant their family would face new responsibilities and scrutiny. Their life, which had already been different from other families, would become even more public and ceremonial. But more than the practical changes, Charlotte was grappling with the emotional reality of losing someone she loved. King Charles had been a constant presence in her life, a grandfather who had taught her about duty and service, but who had also played games with her and told her jokes that made her laugh. The night stretched on, with family members taking turns visiting the king and doctors providing regular updates on his condition. Charlotte dozed fitfully in her chair, waking frequently to the sound of hushed conversations and the arrival of more family members and officials. As dawn approached, Charlotte realized that she was witnessing one of the most significant moments in her country's history. When the sun rose, everything would be different, and she would need to find the courage to face whatever came next with the dignity and strength that her family's position required. The first rays of sunlight were beginning to filter through the hospital windows when the doctor emerged from King Charles's room one final time. Charlotte had been dozing against her mother's shoulder, but she woke instantly when she felt the change in the room's atmosphere. The adults around her straightened, and conversation stopped as everyone turned toward the doctor. Charlotte did not need to hear the words to understand what had happened. The expression on the doctor's face, the way her father's shoulders sagged slightly, and the collective intake of breath from everyone in the waiting area told her everything she needed to know. Her grandfather, King Charles III, had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The next few minutes were a blur of activity and emotion. Charlotte watched as her father, now King William V, was immediately surrounded by officials who needed to begin the formal procedures that followed the death of a monarch. Even in his grief, he had to step into his new role and handle the constitutional and practical requirements that could not wait. Charlotte felt her mother's arms tighten around her as Catherine processed her own grief while simultaneously preparing to support her husband in his new responsibilities as king. The woman who had been the Princess of Wales when they arrived at the hospital was now Queen Catherine, though Charlotte noticed that her mother's first concern was still for her children's emotional well-being. George had begun crying quietly, finally allowing himself to show the emotion he had been holding back all night. Louis, still not fully understanding what death meant, kept asking when they would see Grandpapa again. Charlotte found herself in the strange position of being heartbroken about losing her grandfather, while also trying to comfort her younger brother and process what these changes meant for their family. "Come here, my loves," Catherine said, gathering all three children close to her. "I know this is very sad and very scary. Grandpapa loved you all so much, and he would want us to take care of each other and be brave." Through her tears, Charlotte looked around the room at all the adults who were now looking to her father for leadership and guidance. She could see the weight of the crown settling on his shoulders, even though the actual coronation would not take place for months. In the space of a few hours, he had gone from being an heir to the throne to being the king, with all the enormous responsibilities that came with that role. One of the senior palace officials approached her father with a folder of documents that needed immediate attention. Charlotte realized that even in his grief, her father would have to make decisions about the funeral, the transition of power, and the countless details that followed the death of a monarch. There would be no time for private mourning, no opportunity to process his loss away from the public eye. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Charlotte noticed that there were already news crews gathering outside. Somehow word had gotten out about the king's condition, and the world was waiting to hear the official announcement. She realized that within hours their family's loss would become international news, and every aspect of their grief would be scrutinized by the media and the public. The ride back to the palace was silent, except for the occasional radio communication between their driver and the security team. Charlotte looked out the window and saw that London was beginning to wake up, with people starting their normal daily routines, completely unaware that their country's history had changed overnight. When they arrived at Buckingham Palace, which would now be her father's primary residence as king, Charlotte was struck by how different everything felt. The same building, the same staff, the same rooms, but now her father was the sovereign and her mother was the queen. She was no longer just Princess Charlotte. She was the daughter of the reigning monarch, with new responsibilities and expectations that she was only beginning to understand. The palace was already buzzing with activity as staff members prepared for the formal announcement of King Charles's death and King William's accession to the throne. Charlotte watched as her father was briefed by his private secretary on the schedule for the coming days, which would include meetings with government officials, preparations for the funeral, and the complex ceremonies associated with the transition of power. In the midst of all this official activity, Charlotte found herself thinking about a conversation she had had with her grandfather just a few months earlier. He had been teaching her about the history of their family, showing her portraits of previous kings and queens, and explaining how each monarch had faced different challenges during their reign. Being a monarch is not about the crown or the ceremonies, he had told her. It's about serving the people and putting the needs of the country before your own desires. It's about being steady and reliable when everything around you is changing. Now, watching her father step into that role, Charlotte began to understand what her grandfather had meant. Her father was setting aside his own grief to fulfill his duties to the nation. Her mother was supporting him, while also caring for their family. They were demonstrating the kind of selfless service that their position required. Later that morning, after the official announcement had been made and the world knew that King William V had ascended to the throne, Charlotte found herself alone in one of the palace gardens. She needed a few moments of quiet to process everything that had happened and to think about what it all meant for her future. She was sitting on a bench, still holding Mr. Hoppy, when one of the palace guards approached her. She recognized him as Thomas, a kind man who had been working at the palace for many years and who had always been friendly to her and her brothers. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said gently, "I wanted to tell you how sorry I am for your loss. King Charles was a good man, and I know how much he loved you and your family." Charlotte looked up at Thomas and saw genuine compassion in his eyes. In that moment, she realized something important. She was not facing this difficult time alone. There were people throughout the palace, throughout the country, and throughout the world who cared about her family and who would support them through this transition. "Thank you, Thomas," she said softly. "Everything feels different now." "Change is always difficult," Thomas replied. "But your family has shown great strength and dignity today. Your grandfather would be proud of how you've all handled this situation." As Thomas walked away, Charlotte sat quietly in the garden, thinking about the events of the past day and night. She had begun this journey as a confused and frightened child who felt excluded from important family matters. She was ending it as someone who had faced one of life's most difficult experiences and had found strength she did not know she possessed. She thought about her father, now King William V, and the enormous challenges he would face in the coming years. She thought about her mother, Queen Catherine, and how she would balance supporting her husband with caring for their family. She thought about her brothers and how they would all need to support each other through the changes ahead. Most of all, Charlotte thought about her grandfather's legacy and the lessons he had taught her about duty, service, and putting others before yourself. She knew that someday she too would have important responsibilities to fulfill. The little girl who had cried in the palace corridor the night before was beginning to grow into someone who understood what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. As Charlotte finally stood up to go back inside the palace, she felt a sense of resolution settling over her. The future was uncertain and there would be many challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid of facing them. She was part of a family that had served their country for generations, and she would find her own way to continue that tradition of service with courage, compassion, and the strength that came from love and duty combined. The palace fell silent as Charlotte walked back toward the building, but it was no longer the frightening silence of uncertainty. It was the peaceful quiet of acceptance, of a family coming together to face whatever the future might bring.